Now, unemployment and a shrinking economy make the livelihoods of South Africans difficult, as you can imagine. Parents are struggling to pay school fees, and most people rely on debt to survive the month. Schools have struggled to recover fees owed to them by some parents. TPN Credit Bureau CEO Michelle Dickens joins me now from Midrand to discuss this conundrum further. Michelle, thank you very much for your time this evening. Perhaps before we get into the details of parents and their relationships with schools when it comes to fees, just a broad sense of the trends that we are seeing, particularly over the last 2 years with the advent of the pandemic.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having us and to come and chat about what we're seeing in the data at the moment. I think what we're seeing in the data coming into the pandemic period was that there was a dramatic loss of employment in that hard lockdown quarter. There was some recovery in the 2020 period, but during this period of 2021, we've started to see again a dramatic decline in the number of full-time employment. And so we're sitting with 2.2 million people without work who had work 18 months ago prior to the lockdown. And without an income or a permanent source of income, this is going to play an incredibly difficult role on people's ability to continue to pay the credit that they already have and to also pay for living expenses, things that aren't necessarily just credit expenses. School fees form part of that. Consumers' rent forms another part of that. Groceries, transport costs. Transport costs, the roof over your head, your health and your grocery costs account for 67% of consumers' monthly expenses. And these are just our living expenses. This is just to keep ourselves going. And credit obviously feeds a lot into that in terms of credit card expenditure, mortgage expenditure, car finance expenditure. And what we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing an increase in inflation costs. So we're starting to see inflation go up, rising transport costs, rising interest rates. All of this is going to have an impact on consumers' ability to pay their budgeted expenses as those expenses start to increase. Put on top of that, I guess, in January, is school fee expenses. Schools often give parents the opportunity to pay the school fees annually in advance, termly or monthly. But on top of that, parents are faced with the additional uniform costs, stationery costs, textbook costs, costs that will have to be paid upfront at the beginning of the year as well.
No, absolutely. And of course, this does put a lot of pressure on schools who have subsequently had to cut on their budget in terms of the things that they provide to their learners in the schools.
Absolutely. So if we go and look particularly at the school data, we see that this is the worst performing account that we track. So to put the payment priority of consumers into perspective, the roof over the head is the priority for most consumers. So paying for the mortgage or paying for the rent, the roof over your head, this is the first payment that the majority of consumers will make. In fact, 92% of mortgages are in current at the moment, so that they're paid up. When we have a look then at secured finance, we're looking at your vehicle finance. This is the next priority. And then we look at your credit cards. Consumers pay their credit cards because online shopping is a thing during the pandemic and the hard lockdown. So credit card payments were a priority. Those are sitting at 75% in current. Then we drop down to unsecured and short-term credit. And right at the bottom, we sit with school fees. And school fees are cyclical. So we'll see in Q1, we've got school fees sitting at 60% in the hard lockdown period. That dropped down into the 50s. Actually, only 50% of school fees were being paid, were up to date. It deteriorates in Q2 and Q3 and then improves in Q4. So we'll have seen in the last quarter of last year that school fees were sitting at 60% paid up, which means that 40% of school fees are not being paid, 25% outright non-payment, and 15% a partial payment. So that means that schools are battling with only 60% collection, leaving 40% unpaid or partially paid. And schools then have to balance their budgets. What did schools do during the lockdown period? Well, they cut back. Private schools and public schools behaved a little differently. Look, 2/3, 65 and 68% private and public schools cut back on expenditure. How did they cut back? Well, private schools cut back on teachers, on payroll. Public schools cut back on CapEx majority and a little bit of OpEx as well. Then when we had a look at what type of payroll the schools cut back on, private schools cut back on permanent teachers, and government schools, public schools, cut back on temporary teachers and on groundsmen. So the schools cut back the same. 2/3 of schools cut back on some form of expenditure, but it was where they made those cutbacks. And of course, more people ended up unemployed or retrenched or on shorter hours or on less income, feeding back into that unemployment cycle where we're seeing 2.2 million people still without work as of Q3 of last year compared to where we were at the beginning of the pandemic.
Right, and I mean, we're running out of time, but I actually have to ask you about the solution and what would actually work for both the parents and the schools in terms of the collection of school fees in the very best way that we can in the times that we are currently in.
Well, I think for public schools, it's important to take cognizance of the fact that parents at public schools are entitled to an exemption. So where a parent has lost their income or has lost some of their income, they're entitled to apply for an exemption either in full or in part. And the school would then have to be provided with an affidavit, proof of loss of income. And for the period that income has been lost, the best interest of the child must be maintained. So the child must continue to have access to school, have access to the full academic curriculum, any extramural sporting activities, etc. And the parent has access to an exemption for the period that they are without an income. Once the parent has become gainfully employed, is earning an income again, then they can start to pay the school fees from that point going forward. For private schools, it's a case of engaging in, has there been a loss of income, was it temporary, and can we have a payment plan, an acknowledgement of debt that then gets repaid over a period of time. Private schools or children in private schools don't have the benefit of being able to maintain a long-term relationship with the school without paying school fees. So the private school would be entitled on non-payment of school fees to cancel the agreement. Best interest of the child must always be maintained, and the parent would then have to apply either for a government school or for a more affordable private school in the case of an affordability situation. But ultimately, the best interests of the child need to be maintained.